Lovely. Thank you very much, Rob. You said I've done many. I think you missed the word two off there. My experience with these goes back actually to 1999, an evaluation of the UN Capital Development Fund. I'm not going to refer to that because I think we have three more recent ones which were more closely the focus of this study that Rob's been talking about. The first evaluation of UNAIDS in 2002, the independent external evaluation of IFAD in 2005, and then the second review of UNAIDS in 2009. Rather similar to Rob's comments about the GEF with having a regular rolling program of reviews, I think in that case at 4-year intervals. So UNAIDS has, I believe within its formation articles or whatever, the requirement to do a review every 5 years, which is quite good. I want to draw on my experience of those, very much, I think, picking up many of the points Rob has made. I think he's covered all the substance issues that come out, but perhaps if I talk about the comparisons, some similarities and some differences between IFAD and UNAIDS, then it will tease out some of the details underlying these broad conclusions. And I will lead through to 5 lessons or so at the end on that. First of all, I think the number of quite strong similarities, some of which represent very good best practice issues. Both the UNAIDS and the IFAD evaluations were linked to life cycle events in the sense of being tied into a replenishment process or being tied into a strategic planning system. And I think that's a very important issue because it sets up from the very beginning the mechanism by which the findings from the evaluation are likely to be taken up. Other similarities, both were very wide-ranging, very inclusive, much along the lines Rob has discussed already, trying to combine institutional performance and development impact, trying to look at accountability, but also using it as an opportunity for learning. And I think in both instances, especially with the first UNAIDS, neither of IFAD or the UNAIDS built on a good body of summative evaluation. So both were trying to plug a gap, and both really picked up or adopted what I refer to as a big bang approach. We haven't funded the building blocks that really would make the evaluation more useful, so we'll throw a lot of money at this one-off attempt. But inevitably that brings in a lot of compromises in how you go about the work. They both followed a rather similar approach, taking what I would view as a hybrid of a sort of multi-donor evaluation and a country program evaluation. Quite prescriptive methodology defined by the governing body, and I'll say more about the governing body in a moment, but taking a 2-stage headquarters desk review and country visits split, an approach that I think is really familiar to lots of people here. And I think, given that so many of the programs have got a strong country orientation and strong supposed country ownership, then there's a lot of sense in that. But it raises so many issues about what really the unit of study, the unit of analysis for the evaluation should be. In the case of a UN program like UNAIDS, having a country program is a building block of the work, and a country focus is a logical unit. With IFAD, where you're funding individual projects and you want to try to draw some lessons about perhaps subsectoral work or thematic areas, then entering through a country focus doesn't necessarily give you the portfolio of projects that will allow you to draw those sorts of lessons. And I think that's an issue. I think we also have to recognise that choosing countries is a political process, no matter how much you try and randomise. And with UNAIDS, there was a quite overt lobbying and difficulties over who to include and who not to include. With IFAD, to overcome that, we had a delightful random selection. Fabrizio here can remember it, where actually, in order to select countries, the office bought a bingo machine, if you all know what I mean, and random numbers were generated in a public forum that led to the choice of countries. It was entertaining, but quite frankly, from an evaluation point of view, probably not that effective. I can say more about that. And I would say one more thing about the country selection. Really, despite the strong emphasis on country ownership, you'd have to say that these were very top-down evaluations. And really, country ownership was only expressed through the governing body authorization process, and not really ownership on the ground. So there's some similarities and differences. One, I think the most positive similarity come out of those evaluations concerns the governance of the evaluations themselves. Both of them were organized around quite strong initiatives to try to bring independence to the evaluation exercise. And I think they both worked, although in slightly different ways. With UNAIDS, an entirely separate committee was formed of people very knowledgeable, scientifically and socially knowledgeable about the HIV challenge, with separate evaluation advisors. And these were separate from the governing body and separate from the executive of UNAIDS. And that was a very, very effective model in many respects. Interestingly, the monitoring and evaluation function within UNAIDS was not involved at all in the process. And there's some interesting history around that, not for this meeting. For IFAD, a different approach was taken using a subcommittee of the executive body. The evaluation was directed by the evaluation office of IFAD, which has an independent status, although there were some misgivings among many parties about the real independence there. But what made the IFAD evaluation so successful in governance was that two different levels of quality assurance were established with independent evaluation advisors, Bob here being one of them, and that was very effective, especially in dealing with quality issues when the final report came out. So some few quick lessons about this. First of all, I think both evaluations really failed to grasp the intervention logic of their institution in designing the approach. They took quite prescriptive approaches to the terms of reference, directing how the work was to be done, but really hadn't thought through how, in contrast, an agency like UNAIDS, which after all is a UN program, it's a complex organization designed to coordinate the work of UN funds and programs, really understanding how that adds value on the ground, and therefore what an evaluation model might be to test the effectiveness of that. That wasn't done, and I think that's where this simple headquarters country split really probably wasn't so effective in any of them. Secondly, of course, we have this problem about trying to combine investigation of impact with institutional performance. It's mixing too diverse a range of skills and the nature of the inquiry that's required. For the IFAD work, resources were provided to do some very quick follow-up surveys with beneficiaries on the ground. And there was some useful information came out of that was quite comparable with data generated within IFAD itself. But I still think it would have been better to have separated those functions. I've talked about the governance model. The independent governance were very effective, and I think those are lessons that can be picked up elsewhere, and they were particularly effective at quality assurance, IFAD probably somewhat more so than UNAIDS. I think one big weakness was a lack of time and resources for benchmarking and the lack of engagement with other agencies. I think for IFAD, the scope for benchmarking is very high, of course, with the World Bank and Regional Bank. And with UNAIDS, there are some interesting questions about whether agencies perform more effectively when they're coordinated or when they're not. And I think that those are areas that there wasn't the scope or the time to comment on. And to conclude, I think because both were set up in this life cycle pattern, I think both evaluations did form a very strong basis for subsequent action. Both were picked up by executive bodies. You can see in the history of the organisation clear management action plans and follow-up evidence to see the sort of impact the evaluations had. Thank you, Rob.
Okay, thank you very much. And indeed, I would like to invite questions or comments from the audience.